Welcome to Analysis, I'm John Rees. It's not often that a country elects a former Marxist radical as its president, but that's just what has happened in Sri Lanka. And it wasn't a narrow victory either. On a 76% turnout of the 17.1 million voters, Anura Kumara Dissanayake won what even his opponents said was an impressive victory. It was a remarkable turnaround for the outspoken radical who had only won 3% of the vote in the 2019 election. But since then, Dissanayaka's National People's Power Alliance has developed a programme which appeals to the poor and all those suffering from the extreme economic crisis that has devastated the lives of millions of Sri Lankans. He's already dissolved Parliament and called fresh elections for the legislature to try and clear out supporters of the old order. But Dissanayaka's reputation was made as a leader of the Marxist GVP. But he has now to contend with an unprecedented crisis in a country heavily reliant on the International Monetary Fund's loans to sustain its national debt. To tell us more about this, here's an exclusive Islam Channel report.
Sri Lanka's newly elected leftist leader Anura Kumara Dissanayake enters office with high expectations and even higher stakes. Following a decisive landslide victory, the newly elected leader, a vocal critic of global lenders, now faces the difficult challenge of governing a country still reeling from its worst economic crisis in 70 years. His predecessor Ranil Wickremesinghe was voted out after enacting deeply unpopular policies such as doubling income taxes and cutting subsidies. These austerity measures stabilised inflation and revived economic growth after the country's $46 billion foreign debt default. However, the new president has promised to reverse these tax hikes and raise public sector salaries, which endeared him to the nation's poor, but they also pit him against a $2.9 billion International Monetary Fund bailout that many analysts say is non-negotiable. Despite his fiery rhetoric against the austerity measures imposed by his predecessor, the new administration is constrained by the realities of the IMF agreement, which served as a lifeline to the bankrupt nation. According to Murtaza Jafaji, the chairman of Colombo-based economic think tank Advocata, the new president is heavily restricted in the economic policies that he can introduce due to the IMF agreement.
Any kind of reform that requires parliamentary approval, they will be unable to do it. They can only adjust certain things that the presidential power is allowed to do. So I'm afraid that on the fiscal side, there is not much adjustment that can be done in this interim period. So I think there are certain red lines that the IMF will not agree to negotiate. Perhaps two of them is, one is on the fiscal side, the primary balance target, which is 2.3% going into next year. And the second one is that there cannot be any change to the central bank law, which makes the bank independent, where their primary mandate is price stability, and the second is that there is no monetary financing. So they have been saying that they would like to relax tax policy but make it up through tax administration. That is easier said than done, because improving tax administration is a long process that it will not only require change in the culture, but it will require change in systems and the culture of the public also to be more adherent.
As Sri Lanka continues its fragile recovery, Disanayake's first major task will be navigating the restructuring of its massive debt burden. The previous government struck a last-minute deal with international bondholders just before the election, but its implementation now hangs in the balance. Failing to finalise this agreement could open Sri Lanka to legal action from its creditors, a scenario that would further delay economic recovery.
So, will Dissanayake be able to meet the needs of his supporters and still tread the narrow path that the IMF is likely to insist on? There are precedents. Brazil's once and current president, Lula da Silva, trod the road from radical to parliamentary statesman, though not without a spell in jail courtesy of his opponents. So, what is the future for Sri Lanka under the new and radical president? Joining me to discuss all this are Dr. Jihan Pereira, Executive Director of the National Peace Council of Sri Lanka, and Irshad Jamseed, who's a Sri Lankan political campaigner. Welcome to the program, both of you. Dr. Pereira, just give us your view of what it was that produced this election victory. How is it that Sri Lanka came to the point of electing a radical as president?
It can be traced to what happened in 2022, 2.5 years ago, when the Sri Lankan economy collapsed. And it collapsed because the country ran out of foreign exchange.
Yeah.
It could not import, and it could not service its international debt. It became internationally bankrupt. Now, this led to an enormous crisis. There were shortages of petroleum products. There were lines outside the petrol stations that extended several kilometers, and sometimes people had to stay for 3-4 days in the line to just fill up their tanks, their vehicle tanks. There were 12-hour power cuts. There was no medicine. People died because there was no medicine in the hospitals. Now, how did this economic collapse take place? One can say that it was a long time in coming, because Sri Lanka was spending more than it earned for several decades. But in the eyes of the people, and the story that was spread at that time was that it was corruption at the highest level, that the then leaders of the country had ransacked the treasury. And so then there was this huge protest movement that arose, demanding that the corrupt leaders should step down and that there should be new faces in government. But then the president had to flee the country. The government resigned. A new president was elected, not by the people, but by parliament, according to the constitution, and he stabilized things. The economy had collapsed. It had come down, but he was able to stabilize. And in fact, the economy is now recovering, but from a much lower base than before. So people are really, even today, although the economy has stabilized and is recovering, it's at a lower base, and most people are suffering very much. So they are not happy, because what they wanted and what the successor president did not do was he did not tackle the problem of corruption. He did not also not only tackle the problem of corruption, he also used the old people in the government to continue. So this is where people, out of disgust and desperation, wanted a change. They just wanted a change. And that's how the 3% that Anura Kumara won in 2019 got transformed to 43% at this election.
Okay, let me just come to our other guest, to Irshad Jamzeed. Mr. Jamzeed, how stable is the new government? 43% is a serious mandate. It obviously was an election campaign that emerged out of a popular movement, so there's a base of support there. Is that enough to enact a radical program with?
No, I don't think so. Well, he's got the mandate, which is 42%, which is pretty much on Anura Kumara Dissanayaka's base. So we have to now we have already announced the parliamentary election, which is the general election, which is going to take place in 55 days. Now, without a solid majority in the parliament, you're not going to be able to run a stable government. You need the majority. So you need to show you have the majority. So the next challenge is going to be to put the trust in the people's minds within this next 55 days, where this team who's backing up Anura Kumara Dissanayaka is capable to do a solid job and get some reforms in within this 55 days. Because I don't think the confidence people have as a leader in Anura Kumara is still there in the group that's behind him. So Anura Kumara has some big work to do, establishing that trust in people that his team is equally capable, because we have not seen his team. We've only seen 3 parliamentarians so far, which he had to split all the ministries in the country among these 3 parliamentarians. And that's a big ask on each person. So we're yet to see the team behind him and some performance which will contribute towards restoring the people's minds to give the vote to establishing the majority in the parliament, which is going to be a big ask. And the next, followed by, he's going to set up the local governments, the provincial councils in January. And similarly, that level of confidence also has to be restored. So it's not going to be easy. People went to Anura Kumara Dissanayake out of desperation, just like Dr. Jehan Pereira pointed out. It is out of desperation. People have been let down over decades. I think the problem is going far beyond 2022. Right, for decades we have been let down as a community, as a nation, by all the politicians who has put themselves first and their families first, and not the people of the country. We are a rich nation. We are not a poor nation. We don't have to be on the verge of bankruptcy. We don't deserve that, because people didn't do that. The politicians did projects that did not feed into the economy and brought a debt crisis upon the people, which led to the bankruptcy and deprived basic rights like electricity, cooking gas. All these were deprived. So people, out of desperation, voted to Anura Kumara Dissanayake. But the stability is a big speculation, which we can't do right now. But this next 55 days is going to decide whether he can tread forward in a stable government.
And Dr. Pereira, will he get a parliamentary majority that will allow him to back up the presidency?
Well, that remains to be seen. I mean, the indications, well, the first few days indications are very positive. People are happy with what has happened. For instance, his swearing-in ceremony was very simple. And people say no money, no millions of rupees were spent like on a grand ceremony. Then he has also got the former government's advisors and former president's advisors to return the vehicles. And there are so many vehicles now being parked. I think I don't know, 20,000 or something like that. Huge amount of vehicles. And people say that he's now is reducing costs. And also his first appointments of public servants to senior positions have also been good. Like, for instance, he has retained the central bank governor and the finance secretary, 2 very important people from the previous government, but they're government officials. He has retained them. He has changed other positions, but the people he has brought in are good. So the first indications are positive. And also the fact that there was no, triumphalism in either his speeches or in the actions of his supporters, because I think they were told before the election results were announced, the president and his party members all told the people, you are not to celebrate, you are not to light firecrackers, you are not to be violent, which has happened in the past. In previous elections, the winning side goes and attacks the losing side. But it has not happened here. So those are very good signs. And if he can continue like this, even without making big financial concessions to people, which is where his hands are tied at the moment, I think he will do well.
Okay.
It is possible.
Okay.
If I can come in on that point,
yeah,
right?
Just let me put this question to you both, because I agree that's an interesting point. Urshad Jamid, what about the IMF? I mean, we've seen this. I mean, most famously in Europe, with the Greek government, radical government comes to power. Very great hopes placed in it by people who want a change from the old order, utterly crushed by the bankers. What is going to happen when that moment arrives in Sri Lanka?
So the early signs, like Dr. Jahan just mentioned, right? The early signs are looking good, but the people of Sri Lanka has seen this many times in the past. So these early signs of having a humble celebration or not spending money, getting the vehicles returned, we've seen this in the past. In 2019, we saw them, and people are more immune to these types of treats. So we need to do more. When I say we, the government, the Andhra Kumara Dissanayaka's government has to do more to please the public in Sri Lanka, because all these stunts has been pulled in the past. Gotabaya Rajapaksa did them, Maithripala did them, so we've seen them. So this is not going to work this time. And in terms of answering the question, John, in terms of IMF, right? Early signs of what just Anura Kumar Dissanayaka did of retaining the governor of the central bank and the chairman of the monetary board, those are early signs that he's not going to go on his own tangent, like he was telling that he's going to bring his own reforms to the IMF policy, or they're not going to agree, or they're going to walk away. I don't think they're going to do that. These early reforms are showing us that he is going to tread on the same path. That'll be too risky, and I don't think he is prepared to take a risky path of changing it around and trying to do some different debt reformation. I think he's going on the right path with Professor Dr. Nandalal and the other chairman. I think he will go on the right path. I don't think he will be able to do anything brilliant, but at least if he can keep the momentum going in terms of getting the basics right, getting the basic utilities and everything right in Sri Lanka, and also at the same time keeping the foreign reserves in that, not letting it depleted. At the same time, if we can not let the rupee devaluate any further, hold it where it is, because we started off at 200 rupees per dollar and we went up to 400, and now we are trading around 300. So if we can keep this momentum to the next 55 days, I don't think people will be hit very hard on the economic grounds, and IMF reforms will continue. And we may take a long time to come out of this problem, but at least people won't be in hardship as they were in the previous years.
Okay, Dr. Jihan Pereira, what do you think of that? Because what Irshad seems to be saying there is that the circle can be squared, that there can be significant reforms which will make a difference to people's lives, and at the same time stay in the IMF limits. Now, very, very few radical governments have managed to pull that trick off. Can it be done?
Well, I would say that with the limited resources Sri Lanka has, maybe there will be a reordering of our priorities. For instance, in the last 2 years, after the economic crisis, the hospitals were denied resources, the health system was starved, the education system has been starved. Maybe resources will be channeled towards those things which actually impact on people's lives, and areas of less priority will be de-emphasized. I mean, one area, for instance, is the national airline, which has been consuming enormous resources, enormous losses. And I listened to some of the NPP's economic experts talking about it, and they noted that in the last year, for instance, the airline has made operational profits, but the overall position is one of big loss. And then they said the reason for that was that the contracts for leasing and purchase of aircraft had been terribly flawed, massive corruption there. So if that can be restricted, the massive corruption, then the country, as Irshad said, it's not a poor country. It's simply that our previous governments, they borrowed money, for instance, say from some countries, which gave them money for projects which are not efficient, not constructive, not necessary, but where we believe they siphoned off a lot of money and that's why they went into those big infrastructure projects which don't yield a return. So if that can be cut down, and corruption reduced, because anti-corruption is the main reason this government got elected. If they deliver on that, maybe with the resources we have, we can use it much better.
Irshad Jamseed, where on the spectrum of kind of what is often referred to as populist politicians, does the new president lie? Because you might say at one end of that spectrum there are figures like Jeremy Corbyn when he was leader of the Labour Party, or Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France, who are traditionally part of the left, really are only populist by default. They're recognisably people of the left. And then there's some other characters, perhaps the Five Star Movement in Italy, which is much more ambiguous, takes from the left and the right, is defined much more by a kind of anti-establishment stance that you're not quite sure what the substance is. At the other end of the spectrum, where on that spectrum does your new president lie?
Well, he started off years back on the left, right? And now he treaded it, and he knew there is no way forward in a developed world and they have to reform. And I think now they're embracing more rightist policies and they are kind of meeting in the middle. So I don't see any of Andrew Kumara Dissanayaka's mandate or their proposals are showing any signs of socialism or communism in them. They are more towards the middle ground, having a independent government from those type of traits. So I don't think that it's not rightist, it's not leftist, it's kind of hitting the right balance in the middle. That's where they're positioning themselves. So, but yet in practice, how it works out, we'll have to see. But again, I believe those leftist policies will not be suitable for a country where we've been governed on a very middle ground for nearly 76 years. Okay. So I don't think that is going to work.
Dr. Pereira, we're running out of time, but let me give you the chance to answer that question. A populist or a leftist?
No, I think it will be a balance. As Rashad said, the NPP, it's no longer the JVP. The JVP is the Marxist-Leninist party of 40 years ago, which also engaged in revolt against the state on 2 occasions. It is now the National People's Power, a much larger alliance of people, but in which the JVP is still a core element. But as Rashad said, the thinking has changed a lot. I think what will be emphasized is more state and private sector partnership. I think the difference between this government headed by Anura Kumara and the previous one is the previous one was much more neoliberal, giving everything to the private sector, emphasizing the private sector, neglecting the poor masses. This government will emphasize more the state, but a state that is not corrupt, a state that is honest. That it's going to be a challenge. It's very challenging because corruption is deeply entrenched in the system, but also the idealism, because it is the public servants whom we sometimes think are the corrupt people who are, along with the politicians, they voted overwhelmingly for Anura Kumara. I think by 50-60% of the government servants voted for Anura Kumara. So the idealism is there, and the state can be the engine of development rather than just the private sector.
Okay, thank you very much. That was Dr. Jihan Pereira ending our discussion about events in Sri Lanka. We're also happy to have been joined by Irshad Jemseed for that fascinating discussion. And of course, Sri Lanka now is on a different path. How radical that path turns out to be, only future events will tell. But here on Analysis, we'll be following the parliamentary elections that are coming up, the negotiations with the IMF, and the future of Sri Lanka's new radical president. That's all on the future episodes of Analysis. But for today, I wish you a good night.